Accident victims like you deserve better. A husband and wife were rear-ended, and insurance offered them $10,000. We litigated the case and got them $375,000. Qualified expert attorneys can get you more. Call Zirkin and Smerling today.
Good afternoon, Baltimore City. Welcome to City Voters Live Podcast, and I'm your host, Desmond Stinnie, coming to you on this Tuesday, July 2nd, 2 days before Independence Day. And today we'll be talking a little bit more about the Renew Baltimore proposal for property tax cuts in Baltimore City. Last week, we had the pleasure of having Comptroller Bill Henry on the show to discuss his thoughts on the proposal. And be sure to check out City Voters Live episode 25 if you have not already done so, to hear the comptroller and his thoughts on that. We're continuing coverage of that particular tax proposal. We feel like it's going to be on the ballot with 23,000 signatures being gathered for the measure to make it onto the November general election ballot. We feel like it's likely to be there, and want to make sure that all the citizens of Baltimore are aware of the potential impacts, the potential gains that might be realized by the citizens of Baltimore should we receive a tax break on our property taxes, but also the potential perils and what it might do to the city's overall general budget. And last week, there was an op-ed penned by Christopher Meyer, and it was co-authored by the Maryland Center for Economic Policy, and it talked about the Renew proposal, characterizing it as a slash and cut tax cap, and it had a lot of information about what a potential plan like that would mean for the city of Baltimore. So today we are happy to be joined by Christopher Meyer, the co-author of that particular op-ed, to talk to us a little bit about the Maryland Center for Economic Policy, the work that they do around the state of Maryland, and their position and thoughts on that Renew proposal. Chris, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me on, Desmond.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So let's start off here. Let's talk a little bit about the organization that is the Maryland Center for Economic Policy. I know it was an organization that I was fairly unfamiliar with until reading the piece that was written, and since that time I've gone and taken a quick peek. But not everyone in the city might be aware of your organization. So could you talk a little bit about the Maryland Center for Economic Policy and the work that you guys do?
Absolutely. So I'm a research analyst at the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary last year. We are a small, nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank that works to advance broadly and equitably shared prosperity across Maryland. We do a lot of work in Annapolis on statewide policies like the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, strengthening our investments in public schools, things like the Fight for 15, making sure low-wage workers get a decent wage, things like the Time to Care Act, making sure that everyone in Maryland has time to take care of a new child or recover from a serious health condition. So that's a lot of the work that we do, but we also do work on the local level, including in Baltimore. And we believe that an effective revenue system and a fair revenue system that asks most of those with the greatest ability to pay is essential for government and a society that works for all of us.
Excellent. And as far as the activities of the organization, it's obviously it's not a lobbying firm. Is it more of an advocacy firm? How would you characterize the work that's being done?
Yeah, we do both research and advocacy. So our website, mdeconomy.org, has all of our publications on it. We do a deep dive on the state budget, what the trends are looking like for the state, as well as we do work on the city budget. And we really look at the policy choices that Marylanders are facing and how those choices affect families who are struggling on low incomes, how those policies affect working people. So yeah, we do advocacy, and that advocacy really is based in research and in our values.
Got it. Excellent. And the shifting gears here. So moving into the discussion about the proposal that has been formulated by Renew Baltimore. Apparently, they make claims to having significant high-level economists vet this plan and to look at it. And it's the second attempt for it to be placed on the general election ballot. I think in 2022, there was an attempt to gather the signatures, which was an unsuccessful attempt. But at this stage, it looks a lot like it's going to end up on the ballot with 23,000 signatures gathered so far. So can you talk to us a little bit about the piece that you wrote on June 27th? And the center's thoughts on the proposal, its potential merits and potential pitfalls.
Absolutely. So we are deeply concerned about this proposal. I think first I would take a step back and say, what are property taxes? Property taxes are Baltimore's most important locally generated revenue source. They are expected to bring in about $1.1 billion for the city in the budget year that just started yesterday. That's nearly half the city's general fund. Property taxes pay for things like public schools, fire protection, sanitation, libraries, and on and on. So what this tax cut proposal would do is it would reduce our property tax rate from its current level of 2.248% of the assessed value to 1.2% in a series of steps over 7 years. And then after that, it would permanently cap the tax rate at 1.2%. So that is cutting the tax rate by 47%. So it's a really deep cut. I want to talk a little bit first about the context of taxes in Baltimore City. The so-called Renew campaign really heavily emphasizes tax rates, but that presents an oversimplified story. On a per capita basis, local taxes in Baltimore City, that's all local taxes, are only 1% higher than the statewide average. In adjacent Howard County, just next door, property taxes per capita are 23% higher than they are here in Baltimore City, and all local taxes are 38% higher. So Baltimore City's taxes really are not exceptional in a statewide context. What this proposal would do, according to nonpartisan city analysts, the people within the city government whose job it is to keep an eye on the city's budget, this proposal would ultimately cost more than $600 million per year once fully phased in. It would quadruple, excuse me, it would quadruple the city's projected deficits. But the city can't actually run deficits. Like most local governments, we are required to pass a balanced budget. So what that means, it would actually force deep cuts to local services. The city would have to do things like firing or laying off 400 firefighters, 125 EMTs, eliminating the Safe Streets Violence Prevention Program, ending street and alley cleaning, bringing recycling back to a permanent biweekly schedule, ending prenatal health visits, closing 1/3 of neighborhood libraries. I think you don't want me to go on. The list is very long.
Right. Well, I am curious as to how you know how are you aware which services actually would be cut? Like,
that is an analysis that was done by city analysts at the Bureau of the Budget and Management Research. And basically, they looked at the city budget and accounted specifically for things that are required to be funded under state law, like public schools, and things like debt service on capital projects that are existing commitments, and said, after you set aside the stuff that we can't cut, we would actually have to cut everything else by about 40%. And then they looked through and
okay, so this is all the discretionary stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, understood. Understood. And so I want to go back in the conversation a couple of seconds here, where you mentioned the surrounding jurisdictions that I want to talk about the significance of the rate, right? You mentioned that while Baltimore County may have a lower property tax rate, the actual local tax is 38% higher than what we're paying here in Baltimore City.
Howard
County. Is that a play on what the rate may be lower, but the actual assessed value of the property is so much higher that the dollar amount becomes more? How do we arrive at that 38% higher?
Yep, that is due to higher property values as well as higher incomes. And so because we're dealing with different tax bases, in order to pay for essential services, again, those things like fire protection, street cleaning, we need to use a tax rate that will turn that base into the amount of revenue that we need.
Right.
And I want to make really clear, the tax cut campaign wants to say that, the high tax rate is the cause of low property values. It's exactly the opposite. If our property values were higher, we would be able to levy a lower tax rate. But, people want to live in a place with good schools, with high quality of life. They want to live close to their relatives, things like that. And so with underinvestment in the city's school system, in the city's infrastructure, that just naturally will lead to the lower property values that then necessitate the higher rate.
Right. And in our conversation last week with Comptroller Henry, that was a discussion as well, that the Renew plan really banks on the assessed values of properties actually going up, but also bringing online additional, let's say, properties that would become part of the tax base. And I'm assuming that is highly related to the number of vacants that we have coming back online, and that if properties if the value of Baltimore City properties were higher, then it would somehow spur additional units coming online that are currently not generating revenue. Now, we'll see. I don't know how that actually. I haven't read their plan in its full entirety yet, so I can't really speak to the veracity of that argument. But what I'm hearing here is that 600 million.
I think I've lost you.
I have you pretty good. Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can.
Okay. What I think I'm hearing from you is that, roughly $600 million per year, and is that a fully phased in amount?
Yeah, fully phased in.
So obviously this is fairly simple. If you take away $600 million, you have to replace $600 million at least, right, somehow with revenue. And one of the things that I spoke with Comptroller Henry about was whether or not they're seeking that revenue through bringing additional properties online, such as the number of vacants that we have that are currently offline. But also, are we looking at the 33% of Baltimore City land that is currently occupied by nonprofits, and somehow getting to a point where we can generate revenue from that 1/3 of our city's land that is currently not generating revenue? At some point, you have to make up the $600 million. Obviously, you can cut some things. Some things probably need to be cut, but at some point, how does their plan, from what you've observed, how does their plan generate that additional $600 million to bring us back to a balanced budget?
It doesn't. And you can go to their website right now, and if you try to find an explanation of how many new residents they expect, how many new businesses they expect, how much
that has to be spelled out.
Yeah, nothing. There's no explanation, because if they tried to explain it, it would become really clear that their promises are false. So the BBMR analysts took a look at what it would take to make up that money, and essentially the city would have to gain 325,000 new residents in just 7 years and more than 8,000 new businesses. That's 57% growth in just 7 years. Nationwide, in the last 25 years, only 1% of counties have had growth spurts like that, and none have done so from a starting size even close to Baltimore's. So really, how do you make up that revenue? You don't. Deep, painful service cuts are the unavoidable result. And so you're right, Desmond, that there are things that we can do to strengthen our revenue system as it is now, such as renegotiating payments with nonprofits. We strongly support that. That is not an answer to paying for this tax cut plan. It's not even close, just mathematically.
Right. Well, if we are in a balanced budget with just 2/3 of the land in Baltimore City generating revenue, if somehow you bring that other, I guess if you just think about it in very simple forms, if you bring that other 1/3 into paying its equal share, then you should have 1/3 more property tax revenue. So if we're generating $1.1 billion in property taxes, we should be at least generating 1/3 more. So maybe that'll end up being $1.4 billion. But like you said, this is a $600 million cut. And that, even if you could get 100% of that 33% to start paying at a reasonable rate, you'd still be at a $300 million shortfall. And I'm speaking in the most simple terms possible here, just in very simple math. But that doesn't, my concern is that bringing that 1/3 of Baltimore City land that is currently not paying property taxes, if that's not even on the table and part of this proposal, I'm trying to figure out how it can actually work, because I think you're absolutely right. And I did see that number, 325,000 new residents. I don't know what your average assessed value is for those 325,000 residents. Maybe that's the assessed value of each of those properties is maybe low, or maybe it's even high and we're even further in the wrong direction, right? But there's very little, regardless of that, there's very little confidence in me that thinks that this city is going to go from losing what it's lost over the past number of years to be down to 500 and roughly 70,000 residents, to all of a sudden making this phenomenal turn to bringing in 325,000 new residents. That's a non-starter conversation. That's not going to happen,
especially in the context of, if you think about people like rehabilitating vacant lots and then people moving in there, how likely is that to increase if we have a situation where the streets are dirtier, where emergency response times are slower, where we don't have in place public health approaches to reduce violence? That's very hard for me to imagine. And we can also look to some of the supposed success stories that tax cut advocates point to. So one of the cities that tax cutters repeatedly point to is San Francisco in the 1970s and 1980s. They claim, the property taxes were too high in the 70s. And then when California voters approved Proposition 13 in 1978, deeply cutting and then capping tax rates, very similar to what they're proposing here, they're claiming that then unleashed meteoric growth in San Francisco in the 80s. And that simply isn't true. I mean, first of all, in context, you have to think about in the 1970s, San Francisco actually had a growing financial industry. They put up the Transamerica Tower in 1972. So this was not a failing city. But like most large American cities at the time, its population was decreasing. In the 1980s, most large American cities saw their populations increase, and San Francisco was one of them. So that story simply isn't exceptional. But what is remarkable is after this ballot measure, which, by the way, Ronald Reagan hailed as kindling for a prairie fire of nationwide tax cuts, what happened is that property taxes plummeted immediately, and then they stayed down. Even 10 years afterward, property tax revenues were 38% below their 1978 levels. So this story of population growth and then property values increasing to make up the revenue so that you don't actually have to do service cuts is simply false. Even with a massive increase in state support, public schools in San Francisco were decimated. Education funding fell by 22% in the first year and then kept falling for another 5 years. Down the road in San Jose, even that city's explosive tech-driven growth couldn't stop their public school system from going bankrupt. So even if we look at the supposed success stories that tax cutters point to, we are, without question, looking at deep, lasting revenue drops and then deep, painful service cuts. Now in California, that was mostly education. But here, because we are required by state law to fund our public schools, it would more likely be things like fire protection, sanitation, public health, libraries.
Right, things that are already struggling to begin with would be exacerbated. Now, in just the two conversations that I've had, it doesn't feel like you need to be a nuclear physicist to understand that this is a very challenged approach to reducing the property tax rate. It doesn't speak to how the revenue, it doesn't speak to with any real apparently credibility that you can make up the amount of revenue that would be lost. Let's say if all things remain equal and the property tax rate became 1.2% tomorrow, you would have a significant drop from 1.1 billion to roughly 600 million, right? If it's what are you saying here? It's a 47% reduction. So that would leave us at about 700 million. So if there's no driver of revenue that can really be seen, and I'm assuming, let me ask one question before I get to that. The analysis that was done apparently by the city that talks about everything that needed to be cut, is that analysis assuming that this proposal generates $0 of new revenue, 50% of what it's proposing to generate, or 25%? Is it, what does that represent when we're talking about those cuts? What does it represent from their anticipated success of this particular program?
Right. So that analysis is, based on BBMR's estimates of what would happen to revenues, and that is. So, that is sort of a baseline that assumes that the proposal doesn't unlock. It's
flat on its face, doesn't generate a thing.
Right.
Right. Okay. So it's likely to be somewhere between that and what they think. Somewhere. So it is where it would likely end up.
Maybe. But again, when you think about things like reduction, even under the best case, remotely realistic scenario, it's not going to be zero, right? There will be service cuts, and they are going to be deep, even if they're not quantitatively exactly what that BBMR analysis says.
They're going to be significant. Yeah.
In the context of things like no more street cleaning, libraries closing, slower emergency response times, is there going to be a huge increase in property assessments, in population, in income? I don't see that as very likely. So in light of the direct harms of reduced revenue and therefore reduced services, those prospects for growth that they're promising are even less.
Right. Right. That makes sense. And last question here. Like I said, it doesn't take a nuclear physicist to see that this could be something that is very, very damaging to local economy. Do you believe that the folks at Renew actually think that this will work, or what do we think they're doing?
I am not in the business of looking into people's souls. I do know that many of the people behind Renew are wealthy real estate interests who stand to benefit directly from it. I do know that some of the supposed experts behind Renew, the economists that they refer to, are also on record opposing strengthening public school funding, such as through the blueprint. They're deeply opposed to public servant unions, and they're part of national networks that are pushing an anti-government, anti-tax agenda. So, again, I'm not in the business of looking into people's souls, but yeah, this is part of a nationwide, deep-seated agenda to cut taxes, and they are specifically in favor of reducing public services.
Got it. Understood. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm not sure what the next step is for the Maryland Center for Economic Policy. Do you have any, what will your, I said last question, but hopefully you'll be generous enough to give me one more. What does your organization plan to do between now and November as it relates to this, specific proposal, and what is it that you're hoping that the folks that are viewing this really take from the information that your report puts out?
So we plan to continue working hard to educate the public about the ways that this proposal would harm Baltimore residents. We hope that the people who are listening to this right now, if they live in the city of Baltimore and are voters, will vote against it. And we're hoping that you'll tell your friends, your relatives, your neighbors about the ways that this will harm the city's economy.
And promise you this time, this is absolutely the last question. Where can the folks viewing this podcast, where can they find the report that you and your colleagues put together at the Maryland Center for Economic Policy?
Sure. So our website is mdeconomy.org, like Maryland economy, mdeconomy.org. And then that specific report is at mdeconomy.org/Baltimore-tax-cap.
Excellent. And we'll be sure to make sure to put that link in the chat that will accompany this episode of City Voters Live podcast. Christopher Meyer, certainly appreciate you taking the time and your organization being willing to participate and help the citizens of Baltimore become more informed about what is facing on the November ballot. We look forward to having you guys back anytime you feel like you have more information to share with Baltimore City voters. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
Well, the Maryland Center for Economic Policy, as I said, we will put the report that they produced, and it goes through a lot of what the ramifications of the implementation of such a plan that Renew has put forth, what the impacts might be on the city. I haven't vetted it. I haven't looked at it with any through any magnifying glass or anything, but from the two interviews that I've had, it seems fairly obvious that the Renew plan doesn't really talk in any real terms, and we certainly hope to have the folks from Renew join us to fill in any gaps that the critics may have. But from what I can tell, and when you have anything where you're cutting, there definitely needs to be something that generates and fills the gap, because there's no chance that the city can take something, a process where they're getting $1.1 billion, then start receiving $650 million and still be able to function as a city. And as Christopher Meyer rightfully pointed out, there are items in the budget that aren't negotiable, that have to be provided, such as schools and things of that nature. But the discretionary budget would take a hit. Now, someone like me, this plan feels like it's would likely blow up the local government budget. Now, as a citizen, generally, I think that's a bad idea. We need to have the services. We need to have a city that's attractive, that people want to live in, people want to stay in, people want to raise their kids in. There's no question about that. And I want that on its face. However, when we have a city that functions or has been functioning the way that it has, we talk about city services, and we just talked about city services with Mr. Meyer. We had a situation last year where the mayor was trying to cut recycling from its mandated once per week to twice monthly. We have a mandate of what it needs to be done. That mandate was attempting to be ignored until I myself, with my own resources and my own money, filed a lawsuit that said, no, you can't do that. And a circuit court judge told the law department, you either need to change the law or you need to comply with the law. Well, we got compliance. The city had to go out, they had to spend that money, had to get the trucks, they had to get the people, and now we're back to weekly recycling. Now, the mayor can take credit for that all he wants, but I don't think we get that without an actual citizen having to file a lawsuit with 213 other citizens of Baltimore. We had to actually fight for the services that we have a right to have. When we look at the discretionary budget and the mayor takes $15.2 million and dumps it into a Clean Court program, which was a complete sham. And as you saw, that melted down with one of the participants taking money, spending it on personal, or spending it on whatever that wasn't approved in the program. And then it resulted in a waste of taxpayer dollars. We see an administration that's giving out $200,000 a year jobs like they're lollipops. The size of the staff in the mayor's office has exploded, under this administration. The spending is out of control. We see a lot of politics in the way that our budget is handled. The mayor firing good people from good positions in government over political reasons. A couple examples of that recently. You saw Liam Davis is no longer with the Department of Transportation, good employee, doing good for the city. Margot Bruner Settles, recently fired over political reasons. Supervisor of the year in the previous year, doing great work for the city, fired for political reasons. On the other hand of that, you see the mayor's buddy's girlfriend, Kayla Young's girlfriend, Shazia Cager, is in a $180,000 a year no-show job. This person was removed from being the chief of staff, stayed on the city's payroll. Mayor paid her $180K a year or more. And I actually did a poll on the emails for Shazia Cager, public information request, and saw that for an entire quarter, she didn't send one email, not one email. $180,000 a year for a no-show job where she sent absolutely no emails. But yet good, hardworking employees like Margot and Liam, they get fired simply because they're not with the mayor. When we see what's happening with the discretionary budget in Baltimore City because of the executive authority of the mayor, as a citizen, like I said, I want to see the city thrive, but the city is not thriving. And the city's not thriving because of decisions that are being made in the executive branch, because the executive branch has so much power and acts with complete autonomy. There needs to be checks and balances. As a citizen, I am fed up with how our budget is being politicized and how our budget becomes the personal treasury of whoever sits in the mayor's seat. So when I look at this Renew proposal, I don't believe that it'll do the things that they are claiming it will do. I think Christopher Meyer and his colleagues, I think they're absolutely right. I think this would blow up our local economy. I think that there will be significant cuts in service. I think it would be terrible for the city. That's on the one hand, but I have to weigh that against what I see happening every day, which is a blowing up of our budget at the discretion of the mayor. So I have to ask myself, do I care if it gets blown up, if our economy gets blown up? Because what I do know is if this measure passes, it might blow up the budget, and we may have to rebuild it from the ground up. But I think perhaps, and maybe I'm being hopefully too hopeful and too optimistic, but perhaps we won't get the waste and the cronyism and the corruption that we see now. We won't get what Renew wants, but we won't get what we have either. We'll come somewhere in the middle. And I think that would be something that would be beneficial to Baltimore. Would it be painful? Absolutely. Could it be devastating? Absolutely. Would we go through a very difficult time here in the city? Absolutely. But at the end of the day, I don't think that we can keep going the way that we go. And I don't think good people should be fired from their jobs when they're doing great work for the city, while the girlfriend of your buddy stays in a $180,000 a year no-show job, sending 0 emails in an entire quarter. I have the receipts. I pulled the information. So the question becomes, where do we go from here? I hope we don't have to go through that period of uncertainty and that period of where we have to blow everything up. But then I think about cities like Detroit and what they went through. And at some point you had to flush out all of the parasites. And you had to come up with the people who actually loved that place. And they rebuilt it. And I wonder if that's what we need to have here in Baltimore. Well, thank everybody for the time today. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you got a lot of information from Christopher Meyer and the Maryland Center for Economic Policy. I think they're doing fantastic work over there. And I look forward to reading more about what they feel would happen should the Renew policy actually be passed in the November election. But at the same time, I guess if I had my way, the Renew at this point, now I'm still in decision-making mode. I have till November. I would hope that the Renew proposal at this moment, if I had to take a position, I would hope it didn't fail. But I would also hope that no longer would the mayor have executive authority and treat our public funds like his personal political treasury. There has to be something in between, and we need to figure out what that in between is. Thanks, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you in episode 27.